Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Thank you for joining me. This week, with Republicans trying to pass tax cuts and spending cuts across our federal government, I think before we get into in the coming weeks and months, before we talk more about that, I want to talk that in generally why conservatives want such cuts to the federal government and all levels of government, actually. Well, why do they distrust government? Why do they want to shrink the state? This is something I've always assumed about people, but people rarely understand it. So let's go back into history a bit. I promise I won't take too long. Conservatism really began in the UK under Edmund Burke. Conservatism then was actually not about small state or free markets. It was about law and order and protecting property rights, protecting class divisions, and so on and so on. It was simply about preserving the status quo, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. But the status quo was not a small state, especially not in the 1700s in the United Kingdom. Burke was skeptical about the French Revolution, which was ongoing in his day. He supported gradual, not radical change. Lastly, he supported religious values and wanted them as a foundation of society. You still see this in the UK today. One Nation conservatives, as I sometimes describe myself, is similar except that they support democracy and more centrist economic policies. American conservatism is different from other countries that there was never a monarchy in the United States, and because of that, there has never been a push to return to the monarchy or ever establish one. American conservatism instead is focused on smaller government and individual liberties. Some conservatives are less right-wing, conservatives abroad are less right-wing than here. For example, Canadian conservatives, Australian conservatives, Germans, British, they are usually less right-wing than ours, although they have their right-wing people too. They are moderate, and in fact, some of them would be considered moderate Democrats. Our conservative movements came from our founding. It is the debate for 250 years, as of next year, going back to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. American conservatism, unlike British conservatives, are really opposed to any change. They want small state, prioritize liberty and free markets, and is based on the founding of liberty and patriotism. That's based on our founding. In short, ours is much more populist and right-wing. Modern conservatism took shape after the Second World War. From the 1930s into the 1960s, large government, social change, and interventionist policies to equalize society were the norms. Social Security, Medicare, Great Society, Medicaid, welfare state, etc. Since Nixon's election in 1968, we haven't seen much of that since. Conservatives didn't suddenly appear on the mainstream. There was the war in Vietnam, economic troubles, backlash to the civil rights movement, especially in the South, and social unrest brought about 2 decades of conservative rule. First under Nixon and Ford, Carter, a moderate Democrat, and Reagan. Reagan once said that government is the problem, not the solution. And that was kind of a big reversal to almost 40 years of thinking, which was quite revolutionary at that time. Think about it. Eisenhower was not necessarily a small state. He was for the status quo. He had no desire to repeal FDR's programs. However, Republicans do. I think if they did get the chance to repeal Social Security, Medicare, and they knew they could face no backlash from the electorate, I think they would. Because they will, they won't, but I think if they could, they would. In the 1990s or mid-2000s to the mid-2000s, we had neoliberals and neoconservatives, very centrist politicians that didn't really offer much on the left and right wing. Bush was a compassionate conservative, which, as one liberal once called it, taking away your benefits and kicking you in the balls, but doing it nicely and saying that you're sorry. So I thought that was quite funny. After Bush, it was the obstructionist Republicans in the 2010s and Trump, and that's kind of where we are today. Trump is not a conservative. He does not value tradition. I don't think he cares much about tax cuts, only for business purposes. He isn't into social issues like abortion or gay marriage. He is for law and order, and I believe he would support protecting class, keeping class divisions the way it is, and protecting property rights. But I would say he is that comes from more the authoritarian wing rather than the conservative wing of like conservative kind of thinking. So to answer the question, why are conservatives and a small government and small state? Well, they believe that government is a moral hazard, meaning that it promotes bad values. Government is economically inefficient. They value individual liberty. Government doesn't, but conservatives do. And patriotism goes back to the U.S. Constitution. I mean, that's how this country was founded. So does conservatism work? Well, it depends on your outlook, and I would say mostly no. There is a paragraph that explains it well, and I will read it aloud for you. Now, why will the state tend to grow faster than the economy? Well, the economy needs a well-educated and healthy labor force. Second, services supplied by the state are ones in which it is hard to raise productivity, which tends to make them increasingly expensive. Third, spending on transfers and health will rise with the proportion of population that is old and infirm. Finally, the higher spending on transfers and essential services is also what voters demand. So let's go through this. Firstly, the economy needs a well-educated and healthy labor force. Hopefully that's self-explanatory. You need education provides skills and healthy opportunity. Healthy employees are productive. Unhealthy people are not productive, and some that are not productive at all to their health. Second, services supported by the state are ones which is hard to raise productivity, which tends to make them increasingly expensive. This is also true. This is a bit more complicated. So to take a service provided by the state that we all understand, roads. Unless you own your own town or your Disney, which they pave their own roads. Disney really is like a little kingdom, but that's a separate story. Paving a road now and 50 years ago is really not that different. Machines have made it faster than maybe like 200 years ago, but it's hard to be more efficient at paving roads. Like productivity is how much work that you can do in the number of hours. So if it takes 10 hours to pave a road, but a new technology comes out that can make you do it in 8 hours, you are being more productive. At the same time, though, at some point, you can't get more productive. Private companies like tech are constantly getting more productive. Smaller chips, faster modems, better batteries, more efficient processing. You can't really get faster at paving roads. Like that's kind of, you pave a road and that's a road. I'm sure there's gradual changes, but it's really not as extreme as in other industries like tech and finance. Another example is healthcare. Healthcare is about as productive as it was not too long ago. AI may change that, but for now, a doctor can only see so many patients a day. A teacher can only teach so many people at once. All of these, except for healthcare, are state-funded things. Private companies, which always want to grow, don't want to be the ones investing in low productivity tasks. And when they do this, it's often inefficient, expensive, and poor quality. Look at private prisons. Private prisons, they do it for cheaper, but the people that come out of that, they end up committing more crimes later on, which is more expensive because that means we have to put them in prison again. Moving on. Thirdly, spending on transfers and health will rise with the population that is old and infirm. This sounds complicated, but it is really simple if you think about it. Healthcare spending is higher when the population ages, which ours is aging. Hopefully that makes sense. Old people, no offense to any old people listening to this, but if you're an old person, your healthcare is expensive. If you're a young person and you don't have any major conditions, your healthcare is not that expensive. Lastly, higher spending on non-transfers and essential services is what voters demand. This is the political side of it. Voters want better services out of our government, but we all don't want to wait on the phone with the IRS for hours and hours about our tax returns. When are we going to get our tax returns? But nobody wants to be the one to pay for more IRS agents. Speaking of paying for IRS agents, many of them have been gutted. It was reported in the press last week that 20,000 IRS agents have accepted their resignation offer from the Trump administration. With 90,000 employees, this is 25% of the workforce. That's crazy. Let's say on average an IRS employee makes like $60,000 a year. Government employees don't get paid that much, and let's kind of roll in their benefits and things like that too. This means that $5.4 billion is spent on the IRS, making that number up. I don't know. It's going to be a bit higher because there's rent and electricity and equipment and stuff, so it's probably higher than that. And my point is, it's not a huge department with tens of billions of dollars behind it. And if there somehow is, it would be in the low tens of billions, not the high tens of billions. President Biden hired an additional 28,000 or so agents, and this was widely condemned at the time, especially on the right wing. And it's understandable because they would have gone after middle and lower income people as well. But this was actually the right move in hindsight, and I will admit I was wrong about that. I said that Biden shouldn't have hired them, and I don't think I've ever stated this view on the show. And if I ever did in the past, I retract that. but I know I've expressed this sentiment prior to the show's creation in 2022 and 2023. From what I understand, and I don't have a source on this, but IRS agents collect an additional $4 to $5 on every $1 that is spent on their salaries, so it's a net profit of $3 to $4. So if you take my figure of $60K a year, which is entirely made up, as I said, government employees are not paid that well. 60,000 times 28,000 is 1.6 billion. Multiply that by 3 to 4, which accounts for the ratio that I talked about, is about $5 to $6 billion, just rough numbers. But you can imagine that revenue is being lost to tax fraud because it won't be caught. Lost revenue means higher overall taxes or more borrowing, which is bad for everybody. And let me throw this on here before I continue. The anti-tax lobby, they want to make it more difficult for people to pay their taxes. Why do they want to do that? Because if people have a difficulty paying their taxes, then that means that they are going to hate paying their taxes more. If it was easy to pay your taxes, people would be more willing to support taxes. Probably there's never going to be anybody who's like, I love paying taxes, but there's a reason that they want to make taxes difficult to pay. On the other hand, this is a bit off topic, but I wanted to include this. We're kind of trying to transition into something different here. And I want to include, because this has been getting more and more attention, and I think it's really important that Americans are not paying attention to this. I think they should be. And that's the independence of the Federal Reserve. President Trump was going after Fed Chair Jerome Powell, saying that he should lower interest rates. So let me tell you this. If you don't understand what the Federal Reserve does, I recommend you look into that online because we don't have the time to explain that here. President Trump wants to lower interest rates. The reason for this is because it was a campaign promise to lower costs for Americans. Problem is Trump's own policies, which raise costs for businesses and consumers in this time of inflation, would lead to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. At the same time, unemployment is expected to rise, which would usually necessitate lower interest rates. See the problem here? The poison to both problems is the cure to the other, which means that the Federal Reserve, if I was on the Federal Reserve, and I'm not an economist, but if I was, just from what I know, I would do nothing, as they have for the past 2 months, because raising rates is too risky because that could worsen the recession that could be coming, and lowering rates could worsen inflation. Usually, the Fed is independent and makes decisions that are apart from politics. There's a process to appoint the Fed chair that I'm not super familiar with. I believe it's the president selects them and then the Senate confirms them. That sounds right. But I know Trump selected Powell and Biden renewed him for another 4 years, and his term will end in 2026. The question is, can Trump fire Powell? It seems that no, he can't, and if he does, Powell said that he will not leave. Should Powell be removed, in my humble opinion, he should not be. He should definitely not step aside. He is a terrible Fed chair. Don't get me wrong. I do not support him. He oversaw the inflation crisis and did basically nothing to stop it until it was too late. And to be clear, I'm not saying he should have been able to predict the future, but economists were saying that inflation was coming as early as 2021, and this isn't me looking back and Monday morning quarterbacking here, because I remember, and there's no evidence for this because it's not like I told anybody this, but I remember in early 2021 thinking, yeah, inflation is coming. I didn't realize how bad it was going to be, but I knew it was coming. And if I knew it as someone who was 17 at the time, then they should have known it. And they said it was transitory. They ignored it really all the way through for a whole nother year. And in March of 2022, they finally began to raise rates and kept raising them for another year. I think the crazy part of this whole thing is that Trump has said he's not fond of Powell. That's understandable. I'm not fond of him either. But Trump was the one that picked him 7 years ago. One of Trump's appointees has had continuous control of our monetary policy for the better part of a decade now, an entire decade almost. And the reason of the Federal Reserve's independence is so critical is that it gives investors, bondholders, and the global economy certainty that monetary policy of the United States will not be interfered by political forces. If Powell was somehow pushed out, this would likely cause an economic and political crisis. I'm sure the bond market would spike along with the collapse of the stock market. Imagine if monetary policy was as erratic as the tariff policy has been the last month. This is why the president should not be interfering with the Federal Reserve. Yet also, still important, in general, politicians have a pro-inflationary bias. Put Trump aside, politicians in general have a pro-inflationary bias. What do I mean? Politicians prefer lower interest rates before an election so that people will feel better even if it does raise inflation later on. In the immediate short term, like first few months, if people are going to feel better, they'll be spending money, they'll have more money, access more credit available to them. And politicians like that leading up to an election. This is why when the Fed was lowering rates before the 2024 election, people thought that the Fed was interfering in politics. No, they weren't. It was time to lower interest rates. And a good example of this globally was in Turkey in 2023. The president there refused to raise rates. In fact, he was lowering rates as inflation was rising, which only made inflation go up even more. And eventually, as soon as the election passed, interest rates were shot right back up. And for example, this usually happens in countries that don't have independent federal reserves. Prior to 1997, the UK's interest rates were controlled by the finance minister, which was a member of the government, and that's not the case anymore. It is generally accepted practice in Western countries to have independent central banks, especially if you're a large economy. Reversing this and going back to the way it used to be, I don't know if we ever had a non-independent Federal Reserve in America, but going back to the way it was done decades ago is generally not a good idea and would not be taken kindly by the rest of the world. Anyway, that is it for now. I want to thank you for listening. We are fast approaching the end of President Trump's first 100 days. Well, I guess this would be his second first 100 days. And I believe that will end next week. So we'll have one more episode to kind of wrap up what he's done, which could be like an hour long. I'm not actually going to make it an hour long, but it certainly feels like it could be. Thank you for listening, and once again, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.